Let's watch the clip of what Keir Starmer had to say. This was the Global Progress Action Summit in Canada.
Most of the conflict with the UK being outside of the UK arises insofar as the UK wants to diverge and do different things to the rest of our EU partners. Obviously, the more we share values, the more we share a future together, the less the conflict. And actually, different ways of solving problems become available. You know, actually, we don't want to diverge. We don't want to lower standards. We don't want to rip up environmental standards, working standards for people at work, food standards, and all the rest of it.
Well, earlier I spoke to James Murray MP. He's Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury. So if Labour became the government, he would be one of the most powerful people in the country, one of those Treasury ministers, just under Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor. I asked him just about this on divergence from EU standards. What does Keir Starmer really mean? What is he saying here? I tried to get a straight answer out of James Murray, and I'm not sure I got one. I'll let you judge. Let's just watch this clip from a little bit earlier in the programme.
Well, look, obviously, you know, we are outside of the single market, outside the customs union. We are pushing the government to sign trade deals with other countries, which is different from when we were a member of the European Union. But what the comments that you're referring to are about UK standards, and we have no interest in watering them down.
But he also said he didn't want to diverge from EU standards. I'm sorry, James Murray, I'm just trying to get an answer out of you. Yes or no, are you happy to diverge from EU standards?
Well, look, obviously, you know, we're outside the European Union, we're outside the single market, outside the customs union.
James, sorry, can you just give me a yes or no?
But the comments that Keir Starmer made were very clearly about the UK standards and what our approach to them is, and we're not in the business of wanting to water down those standards.
OK, I just don't feel I'm getting an answer on that, James, but thank you anyway. Maybe I will get an answer from Sebastian Payne. He is the director of the think tank Onward. Sebastian, good to talk to you this morning. How are you?
Very well, thanks, Peter. How are you?
Very well, thanks. We probably should, for a little bit of context, say that Sebastian is on the candidates list for the Conservative Party as well, just to be totally transparent about that. And I wish you well in your search for a seat, Sebastian. Just in regard to what Keir Starmer has said there, this is become very clear over the past few hours, and it is causing some ructions. What do you make of his views there? He doesn't seem to me anyway, to have accepted Brexit has happened. We have Brexited. We have left the European Union, and we don't. The whole point of that is that we can do things differently from other European nations, specifically EU nations.
It's a very curious development, not one that I can fully understand, because if I go back to my former life when I was a journalist and wrote a book called Broken Heartlands, A Journey Through Labour's Lost England, where I went on a 6,000-mile road trip around all those places that Labour lost for the first time ever in the 2019 election. And one of the key things I found there is that millions of people across the country voted Conservative for the first time, as the slogan went, to get Brexit done, that they wanted to leave the EU, where they were Remainers or Brexiters, and didn't want to talk about it anymore. And that was, in some ways, why the Conservative campaign was so successful. So reopening this question at this juncture seems very odd to me, because it's not something that is near the top of people's priorities. And on the policy itself, you're right, Peter, that the whole point of Brexit was to be able to do things differently. And we've done that when we saw the vaccine procurement and rollout. That's something we did differently because we had left the EU. If we look at our foreign policy response to Ukraine, I think that's also something that we acted a bit more nimbler than had we been a member of the bloc. So we have done things differently. I think there's many more things we could do differently that we should be pushing harder and faster on. But Keir Starmer essentially here has said is he's not interested in that. He's not interested in the central premise of Brexit, which is leaving the EU to do our own thing. And essentially he wants to remain in the orbit of the EU. So I think both in politics and policy, it's pretty awful.
It is a tough one for Keir Starmer, certainly, and I wonder whether he can claw it back. We'll see. Let's talk about another politician, Jeremy Hunt. He says tax cuts are virtually impossible. Do you agree?
I think the priority has to be get inflation down, and that does seem to be happening. And the OECD, which is the big international body that assesses all economies, has said that it should get down towards 3% next year, which will be a huge relief for households and everyone across the country. But I think as soon as there is fiscal room, tax cuts do need to be looked at, because the fact is the burden is its highest in 7 decades. And, you know, that does have a real effect on people's pockets. At the moment, I can completely understand why inflation is the priority, but I'm sure buried away within the Treasury, there are people who are thinking when we've got that fiscal headroom, if the finances do improve, we'll be looking at chopping back the burden a little bit.
Are you as optimistic as Jeremy Hunt? Do you think the tide is turning on the economy? I certainly hope so.
I think we all hope so, Peter. And I mean, famously, I think it was Norman Lamont in 1992 talked about the green shoots of recovery and was slightly mocked for saying that. And I think, I think Mr. Hunt is right to be optimistic because things do seem to be getting better. Inflation does seem to be coming down. And the Bank of England's decision to hold interest rates, I think, was very important on that. But ultimately, I think it's steady as she goes at the moment because, the reason inflation has been so high has been the war in Ukraine and the long-term effects of the COVID pandemic. They're both things that, the war in Ukraine could change or disrupt things even further. But for the moment, it is starting to look as if we've turned a corner.
In terms of turning a corner, net zero is a major aspect of a major policy change from Rishi Sunak. Do you see him as a flip-flopper, a U-turner, or someone who's making sensible, practical policy decisions?
Well, I think, look, with the net zero thing we've seen over the past couple of days, I think the key thing is Rishi Sunak is not changing the ultimate destination. He's still saying we're going to abide by our 2015 legal commitment to hit net zero. So the destination is the same. It's just taking a slightly different road to get there. And I think the changes he has announced are pragmatic because ultimately with net zero, you've got to take people with you. And my think tank Onward has done research to show that how crucial it is that you've got to that people have gotten the right help from the government, that they're on the journey to understand why it's important to decarbonise. So I don't think the government's new approach is changing that. It's about getting there in a different way. And I think, you've got to have consistency on this. And I think when Mr. Sunak made that decision, he was obviously doing it to make sure that this is one big change and we're not flip-flopping over the time on this. So I think now we've got these targets, now we know what we're doing in terms of the end of internal combustion engines, heat pumps, off-grid oil boilers, that we just do stick to them and we crack on with doing it.
What about HS2, Sebastian? It looks as if, well, there's certainly a lot of speculation that the branch to Manchester may be axed. Do you support it or not?
I think, the problem with HS2 is that it's obviously the whole thing is being mismanaged very, very badly. And I think if you were starting from scratch, you might look at doing things very, very differently. I've always been a great supporter of HS3, which is connecting the northern cities together because, where I grew up in Newcastle, it takes as long as it is to get from Newcastle to Manchester by train as car, getting through and around the Pennines. So I think that is obviously something that does need to be looked at. But I think with HS2, it is being built right now. If you drive up towards Birmingham, you'll see it is there. And I know the government's looking at various things at the moment, but I think ultimately it would be a good thing if it still goes ahead because of all the energy that's gone in. But I can understand there are some real cost pressures they've got to manage there. So we'll have to just see what happens on that one, I think.
OK, Sebastian, thanks very much. Sebastian Payne, who's director of the Onward think tank. He's also attempting to be a Conservative MP